let's take a look at a complex example. We're going to be looking at Redux. No, we're going to skip MobX. Sorry, MobX folks. But if you know MobX, you know that Flutter's set state is very similar to MobX observables. So while they're not the same, and I know I'm going to get some hate mail for saying that, they're pretty similar, so you really don't need MobX. Redux, however, is a different animal. Redux is very complex, and if you know Redux, you can safely skip the next few seconds of me talking. However, if you don't, pay attention because it gets pretty complex pretty fast. So what is Redux? Well, it's state management. You have to remember a lot of the frameworks out there don't really have state management the way Flutter does. So Redux helps them. Here's a good example of what Redux actually does. You have an action. The user does something. They click a button. They want the application to do something. That action goes through what's called a reducer, which reduces that action to a new state. That's very important, meaning you can't modify the existing state. You have to return a new state. Then that updates the data store. The store updates the user interface, which goes back to the user being able to perform more actions. This happens very quickly in the background. And it's a very good example of what Redux actually does under the hood. So, looking out at pub.dartlang.org, there is Redux 3.0. It was developed by John Ryan and Brian Englund. I don't know either of these gentlemen, but they've done an outstanding job so far. And we're going to pretty much just rip out some of their examples and go through them and modify them a little bit. This gets pretty intimidating pretty fast, and this is built for multiple things, not just Flutter. So the first thing we need to do is let's install Redux. And we're going to do a single page example here just to, mire out any complexity because Redux is complex enough. Then, once we get that, we're going to need to actually install Flutter Redux. Let's go ahead and put that out there. Now, why do you need both? That's a very good question. And while this is updating, we'll go over it. Redux is, well, the implementation of Redux written in Dart. Flutter Redux is a different animal altogether. Flutter Redux takes that Redux and allows you to build Flutter widgets around them. Because remember, Flutter is built on Dart. So that's the Dart implementation of Redux and then the Flutter implementation of Redux on Dart. That's a bit of a mouthful here. Now, there are some requirements. You need to run this in Dart 2. To do that, let's go in here and let's edit our configuration. What we need to do, because Dart 2 is not fully out yet, is we need to say preview Dart 2. If you ever want to test your code to make sure it's Dart 2 compliant, just add the additional arguments --preview-dart-2. And let's run this and see if it goes. It says it went. Let's try it one more time. Let's actually just kill it and rerun the whole thing just to make sure. Sometimes this IDE, and this is not a problem with Flutter or Dart, but sometimes this particular IDE doesn't like picking up those additional properties and you have to do a full restart just to make sure. All right, it didn't crash, so we're just going to assume we're running in Flutter 2 preview. And let's go ahead and let's import some packages here. I'm just going to import the Flutter Redux and Redux itself proper. Now, I'm going to add some comments in here. And we're just going to add those parameters in for anybody grabbing the source code. Flutter, of course, takes actions. So we're going to make an enum. And enums are quite typical for actions. We're going to say increment and decrement. So we just simply increment or decrement a counter. Now we need a reducer. There we go. So we've got our actions. Now let's go ahead and build our reducer. So what a reducer does is it takes that function and returns a new state, completely new, does not modify the existing. And this will be a little bit confusing in Dart. So we're going to say int. Here's our reducer. And let's say we want an int state and a dynamic action. Already, you're probably screaming at your screen, but you're literally returning state. Not necessarily. That variable is actually recreated and a new variable is sent out. That's just how Dart works under the hood. So let's go ahead and let's make our reducer here. If action equal, and we're going to say actions.increment, then we're just going to say state plus plus. So we're going to increment that, and then let's handle the decrement. And then we're just returning our new state object here, whatever that may be. Now, we've got a little extra work here in our main. Let's go ahead and let's make our store. Notice how it wants a reducer. The first thing we need to do is tell it what type of information we're going to be working with here. So we've got our reducer, and then initial state, let's just set that to 0. Note that this is a very simple Redux example. Redux can get extremely complex very quickly. Now, we're going to change this around a little bit here, and let's just get rid of all of that. Let's make a new my app here. And we're going to extend the stateless widget. Why stateless? Because, well, Redux is going to be handling the state for us. We'll add our build in there. Now, what we want to do is, let's say, final store. And we want an integer type of store. So there's our store object. And we're just going to pass the store down as part of the constructor. I'm going to return null for the moment just to satisfy the IDE. Very important, in run app, we're not doing a new material app. What we're going to do here is we're going to say new my app. And then in here, we're going to set the store. And we're going to set that to the store that we're creating in the main function here. So what we're really doing here is we're making a new store and then passing that store to the my app, which extends the stateless widget. Bear in mind that we also have actions and reducers, but these exist outside of our application. They are pretty much just global here. Now we need to build this bad boy out. Let's go ahead and start working on this. So what we want to do next is we want to return a new store provider. And let's branch that out. So we have a store and a child. Store is just going to very obviously be our current store that we're working with here. And child is, well, this is our child hierarchy. So let's go ahead and make a new material app. That way we can get all the Flutter goodness in there. And in material app, we're going to add a title. Along with a home. And this is going to be a new scaffold. This takes us back to intro to Flutter, doesn't it? All right, so we got our app bar. We're going to make a new app bar here. Title is just simply going to be a new text. Now in here, we also want our body. And let's make a new container. The container is going to have a child, and that child is going to be a column. There we go. And then of course children for widgets. This part may seem tedious, but just bear in mind that other platforms, other frameworks working with mobile code is a royal pain. You have to do this for each operating system. So not only do you have to do it once, but then you got to go into each operating, so for iOS, Android, and everything else, and it just gets insane. Okay, so what we want to do now is we need to make a connector. This is special. We can't just go into a Flutter control and start binding properties like state. We need to actually connect this to the Redux store. So make a connector. We're going to do a new store connector. We already see there's a builder, meaning we're going to have to provide some sort of function to build out a widget, and a converter. So in the converter, we are just simply going to say bang, fat arrow that over to the store, the current state of the store, and we're going to say toString. Now the builder, this is where things are a little interesting. We need to actually build a Flutter widget. So let's say context and let's say count. Now that we have our context and count, we're just going to return a new, and let's say text. We want a style, let's say a new text style, and in here we're going to say font size. We're just doing a little styling here, 24.0, just because we want it bigger. Let's go ahead and run this just to see what happens. Make sure we don't have any little issues here so far. Uh-oh, build failed. What about this build failed? Unhandled exemption. Character offset at null. Flutter Gradle 421. Finish with non-zero. This is an interesting one, folks. I'm going to go ahead and pause this and figure out what's going on. Okay, I did actually figure out what was going on, and it really wasn't anything that I did wrong, unfortunately. I had to go into and do a Flutter upgrade and then run Flutter Doctor. Apparently the version on this box was a level behind the version that I actually wrote the code on for original test purposes. So let's just do that again just to make sure we're up to date. We are Flutter Doctor, bam. So apparently the version that I was running did not like the edit configuration additional arguments in there. Let's put those back in there just to preview Dart 2.0 and rerun this thing. Just to verify everything's working. Unfortunately with Flutter, this is one of the downfalls, is that it's a fairly newer platform on a fairly newer language, so things are always growing and changing. If that scares you away, it might not be the language for you, but if you've gotten this far into these tutorials, I think you're probably in love with Flutter by now. Looks like everything built, and there's a big fat 0. So we're good to go. Let's go ahead and continue diving in here. We've got our store connector, and all that does is connect a widget, in this case this text, to the actual store. Now that we have done that, we need to actually put in some input here. We need some way of actually working with our actions. So to do this, we're going to say new row. And let's put a comma there. Main axis alignment, I want this to be on the center. We're just going to add a few buttons here. We're going to add a new icon button. And for the icon, we'll say, and I want the icons.add. That's one feature I love about Flutter, is that the icons are just built right in. I don't have to mess around with anything. The on press, we're going to do what's called a dispatch. Working with Redux, you have to dispatch an action to the store. So we're going to say store, and we want dispatch, and we want the actions increment. So what this icon button is going to do is just increment. And let's take this, copy and paste, and let's decrement. Let's stop that, and let's rerun the whole thing from the ground up just to make sure everything works as expected. While we're waiting, I guess we'll just talk about our code here. So all the way to the top, we've got not just Redux, but also Flutter Redux, which builds upon the Dart implementation of Redux. I've added a few notes. Must use Dart 2, add additional params, preview Dart 2. Take note, sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. Right in the developer notes, they said you must use Dart 2. I've got it to work with and without, but I wouldn't trust it without. We have actions. Remember, actions are something the user wants the application to do. In this case, increment and decrement. We have a reducer, which takes an action and returns a pristine new state based on whatever action we want to take in. So we have action increment, action decrement. They're both returning a new state. Then we have our main. In our main, we're creating a new store and making a new copy of my app in memory and pushing the store down to it. Because that store is in there as a part of the constructor, we have access to this whole thing and all of the child tree. When we look in here, you can see how we're returning a new store provider, and it's expecting the type of integer. So we know what we're working with in our store. All the way down here, we see that we have a store connector. This is one of the kind of pitfalls of using this, is that you can't just say use a Flutter widget and then bind it to using state and the things that we've done so far. You have to do it kind of the Flutter Redux way, if you will. So we have the store connector, which calls a build, and then we could just build that out. If we had a complex widget, we could just dump it into a new file and then call it out. Then we just have some Flutter resources here, icon buttons, calling increment, decrement. So let's see if we can actually fix that. Hot reloading didn't like that. Let's go ahead and redo this. Full restart. All right, so now we can increment and we can decrement. We know that Redux is working because we're in a stateless widget. We're not managing the state. Redux is.